Hey, so I want you to think back to the last time you actually went to a McDonald's. Not ordered through an app or not picked something up on DoorDash or Uber Eats or Grab or whatever they have wherever you are. Actually physically went to one. Maybe you were on a road trip and you pulled off the highway at three o'clock and you were starving and the next exit wasn't for another 40 miles. Maybe it was in the drive-thru last Tuesday morning because the coffee at home was out. Or maybe it was when you were 8 years old and your mom took you for a Happy Meal as a reward for getting an A on your report card, or whatever it may be for you. For me, my most specific McDonald's memories are actually from the other side of the counter, because I actually worked at one when I was 16 and 17 and around there. I started as crew, and then I got promoted to crew leader and to floor supervisor. So I've spent some time inside the machine that we're going to talk about today. And it doesn't really matter what side of the counter your memory is on, though. Almost everybody watching this has a really specific McDonald's memory, because the place is impossible to avoid. There's roughly 13,700 of them in the United States alone, and around 43,500 of them worldwide. And from what I found in my research, the company is publicly targeting 50,000 locations by the end of 2027. They serve about 70 million people a day. Works out to about 1 in every 120 people on the entire planet every single day. So by whatever measure you want to use, McDonald's is one of the most successful businesses ever built. But here's something that most people get completely wrong about how this whole thing actually happened. And I think it's worth a few minutes of your time. McDonald's wasn't really started by the McDonald brothers. Sure, technically the name comes from them. Their name was literally McDonald, and they ran the original restaurant. And that part is absolutely true. But the McDonald's that we know, the chain, the system, the global empire, the real estate company that happens to sell hamburgers, was built by somebody else. And that somebody else was a guy whose name was Ray Kroc. Now, here's where it gets a little bit strange. Ray Kroc was 52 years old when he first got involved with McDonald's. He had bad arthritis. He had diabetes in an era when, before modern insulin management and things like that, was a much bigger deal than it is today. Not that it's not still a big deal. And he'd been selling milkshake machines out of the back of his Cadillac for about 15 years. And by 1954, the sales were starting to dry up. By every reasonable measure that you could possibly use, this was a guy who should have been thinking about retirement or whatever comes next, and not starting an empire. He had no kitchen experience, he had no franchise experience, and he had no money. And then 7 years later, he was on his way to being a billionaire. So here's the actual question I want to walk through in this video. How does a 52-year-old failing milkshake machine salesman who's never run a kitchen in his life turn a single burger stand in San Bernardino, California, into one of the largest companies in the history of the world? Because, and I'm going to say this right now, when I first started reading about Ray Kroc, I thought I knew this story. I'd heard they saw a system where everybody else saw a burger stand version. I'd seen the movie, which I know some of you are going to mention in the comments. But after a few weeks of going through Kroc's autobiography, grinding it out, plus John F. Love's McDonald's Behind the Arches, which is the closest thing to a definitive business history of the company, and Lisa Napoli's Ray and Joan, the real story is actually a lot weirder than the version that most people tell. In fact, there's a 6-year stretch in the middle that almost nobody talks about because it's not really that exciting on the highlight reel. But I think it's where the real juice is. So let's go through it right now. Now, before we get into how Kroc actually did it, I want to make sure that we're on the same page about what McDonald's actually is today. Because, and this is the first thing I want to flag, is most people are wrong about this too. Most people think of McDonald's as a hamburger company, a fast food joint, all that sort of thing. And sure, in the sense that they sell hamburgers and milkshakes and stuff, that's accurate. The Big Mac is famous, the Egg McMuffin, the drive-thru, Ronald McDonald, rest in peace, my friend, all of that up at the customer-facing side. That's not where the money actually comes from. McDonald's as a company makes most of its profit from real estate. McDonald's owns or controls the land underneath thousands of its franchise locations, and the franchisees pay rent every single month. There's a quote from the company's former CEO, a guy named Harry Sonnenborn. By the way, we're going to come back to him in a few minutes, where he said it really plainly, actually. And what he said was this: we're not in the hamburger business, we're in the real estate business. And I'll be honest, even though I'd worked inside of McDonald's, I had no idea about this until I started reading the corporate side of things for this video and some other content that I've made on other platforms. Because when you're 17 and you're working in the drive-thru, you're thinking about what time you get off and whether the fries are done, not whether the parent company makes more money from leasing land than from selling Big Macs. But once you actually look at the financials, pretty unambiguous. Roughly 95% of U.S. McDonald's restaurants, all that 13,000 we talked about, are franchised. And the franchise segment which is where the rent and royalty revenues lie, is dramatically more profitable than the company-operated restaurants. I'm talking by a lot. The numbers are actually absurd when you sit with them. 43,500 plus locations, 70 million people a day, and the parent company is worth about $196 billion. But here's the thing, none of this happens if a 52-year-old broke, sick, and out-of-option salesman doesn't pick up a weird phone call in 1954. So let's go back and walk through who this guy was and how he ended up running the whole thing. Ray Kroc was born in 1902 in Oak Park, Illinois. A pretty unremarkable middle-class upbringing. He dropped out of high school during World War I to try to be an ambulance driver, but that ended up not going anywhere, and the war ended before he was shipped out. He worked a bunch of jobs in his 20s and his 30s, paper cups, real estate in Florida, even a stint as a piano player on the radio. If you don't know what the radio is, kids, go look it up. Honestly, though, if you read his biography, you get the sense of a guy who was trying everything and really succeeding at anything. I remember being one of those myself. But eventually, he ended up selling milkshake machines, which is where the story that we actually care about starts. Now, the machine he was selling was called the Multi-Mixer, made by a company called Prince Castle. Now, the thing that made it unique is that it had 5 spindles, meaning that it could make 5 milkshakes at the same time. That was its whole pitch. That was its whole unique value proposition. It could make 5 at once. And sure, look, that sounds like a weirdly specific product to base your entire career on, but for a while, it actually kind of worked out for him. The post-war American drive-in boom was a real thing. You had diners and soda fountains and burger stands, and they were opening everywhere. And Kroc had the exclusive distribution rights for the Multi-Mixer. And through the 1940s, he actually made a living. Now, he wasn't rich, but he was fine. But by 1954, that was all over. The market had saturated, and most of his good customers had already bought a Multi-Mixer years ago, and they weren't going to buy another one because they don't need to make 10 milkshakes at a time. And the things held up well. And then on top of that, cheaper competitors were starting to undercut him. And since his only value proposition was that it made a lot of milkshakes, it made it really difficult. And on top of that, he was 52 years old at this point, and he had arthritis bad enough to that driving across America in a Cadillac was actually physically painful. And diabetes, which in the 1950s, before modern medicine and all the things we can do now, was a much bigger deal than it is today. And again, not saying it's not a big deal today, but it's worth sitting what 52 in 1954 meant. Okay, picture this for a second. Average American life expectancy at the time was about 68 years old. Most people in their early 50s were looking at maybe 10 or 15 years of working life left before they were done. So that was the trajectory Ray Kroc was on. A failing salesman in his 50s watching his one product slowly die in the rearview mirror. Then, in 1954, he got a strange order. It was from a burger stand out in San Bernardino, California, that wanted to buy 8 multi-mixers. Yeah, 8. So do the math on that. 8 times 5, that means they wanted to be able to make 40 milkshakes at the same time. And before I tell you what he did about that, guess for a second. Most restaurants bought 1. Maybe they bought 2 if they were really busy. 8 machines could make 40 milkshakes at the same time. Now, at this point, Kroc had been doing this for over a decade, and he'd never seen an order like that before. So what would you have done? What most salespeople would have done was shipped the 8 multi-mixers, said thank you, and gone home and been happy with a nice commission. But that's not what Kroc did. Kroc figured something was different here. So what he did is he flew out to California and drove east of LA and to the middle of nowhere. And he walked up to a small octagonal building with 2 yellow arches on the side. And he stood on the sidewalk and he watched. And what he saw was a line of customers wrapped around the building, moving the way a factory line moves, not the way a restaurant line moves. People were getting their food in 30 seconds. Same exact burgers, same exact fries, same exact wrapping, identical every single time. And the 2 brothers running the place, Dick and Mac McDonald. And by the way, if your last name is McDonald, please don't name your kid Mac. Had built was effectively an assembly line for hamburgers. 9 items on the menu total. No waiters, no silverware, no plates. They didn't even have a telephone. Just cash and out the door. And here's the part that matters. Everyone else who'd ever walked up to that building had just seen a successful burger joint. What Kroc did is he walked up and he saw a system, a different thing entirely. And honestly, this is the thing that I keep coming back to. The same way of seeing the world that makes Kroc spot the system in San Bernardino is the same way of seeing the world that lets him grind through the next 6 years when nothing was working. It's not really being about clever in one moment. I know Hollywood teaches us that, where somebody just has this epiphany of a great idea and everything falls into place. That's not how it works. What it's really about is being the kind of person that looks at things differently and consistently for years. That's a much rarer trait than spotting one opportunity in a moment and just going with it. Coming back to our story, he went inside and asked the brothers how they did it and pitched them on franchising it nationally. Thinking about that for a second, he came there to sell them 8 milkshake machines that they'd ordered, maybe grab a burger, and here he was cold pitching them on franchising their restaurant nationally. And of course, the brothers were not interested. They'd actually tried franchising before, and they'd hated it. They hated dealing with franchisees who didn't follow their system, who cut corners, who made the brothers look bad, all the headaches that come along with owning franchises. And they were happy doing about $200,000 a year in sales, which between the two of them, which in 1954 was a small fortune. I know people in 2026 that would kill to make that much money. So Kroc was a salesman, so he kept pressing, and eventually they managed to cut a deal. He could franchise McDonald's nationally, and he'd take on basically all the operational work, and they'd get a 0.5% royalty on every dollar of franchise sales in perpetuity, and final veto over any change to the system. That deal on paper should have been terrible for Kroc, and we're going to come back to that. So let's move forward a little bit to April of 1955. Ray Kroc, 52 years old, broke, sick, with no restaurant experience whatsoever, opened the first McDonald's franchise under his license. It was in Des Plaines, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. Now, before we keep going, I want to sit with how strange this move actually was for a second. Kroc had never run a kitchen. He'd never managed a food service operation. He had no real financial cushion. He was taking on debt to fund the franchise. And by the way, don't do that. He just signed a deal that gave him most of that headache and none of the profit. He was in his 50s in an industry he'd never worked in, so by any rational measure, this should not have worked. But Kroc was obsessed. An obsession can really overcome a lot of obstacles you face in business. And from the day Des Plaines opened, he treated every detail like it was sacred. The guy who owned the franchise rights to the brand was personally out there scraping up gum off the asphalt. Imagine that. He timed every process and rewrote the manuals when anything went over the standard. I'm talking quality, service, cleanliness. The brothers' 3 operating principles, what they called QSC. Kroc would later add value to that to make it QSC and V, but the original 3 became his religion. He insisted that every franchisee followed the system exactly. No shortcuts, no exceptions. And by the way, those principles aren't historical trivia. I remember that when in the 90s when I worked there, they talked about them, and they're still operational standards today in 2026. Like I said, when I was working at McDonald's as a teenager in the 90s, those words were posted on the wall in the back office, and we got measured against them on every shift. The fry timing protocols, the drive-through window timing, the cleaning rotations on the bathroom every 30 minutes, all of it traces back to what Kroc did Des Plaines in 1955. 70 years later, a teenage kid in a small town McDonald's is operating under the same standards that Ray Kroc personally rewrote with a stopwatch. He was not running a restaurant. He was protecting a system, and the system worked. By 1959, there were over 100 McDonald's locations. By 1960, there were more than 200. The brand was getting genuinely famous. The Golden Arches were becoming a real symbol of post-war American life. But here's the part nobody really talks about. Through all of this, through the 100 locations, 200 locations, the brand becoming famous, Ray Kroc was still not getting rich. In fact, he was almost going broke. Now, I know what you're thinking. How is that possible? If the chain is famous and growing, how is the guy running it broke? And that's the right question to be asking at this point in the story, so let's get into it. Now, here's the actual question. If the brand was getting famous and stores were opening everywhere, why was the guy running the whole thing almost going broke? And what changed? Because we know how it ends, right? So what changed to make him stop going broke and start getting rich? Little real world reference there for you. There are basically 3 moves Ray Kroc made that turned a successful burger chain into a global empire. And before you say it, yes, I know about the McDonald brothers buyout. That's move number 3. But the first 2 moves are the ones people skip over, and they're the ones that actually built the company. So what I want to do right now is go through them with you in order. Number 1, he didn't quit during the 6 broke years. From 1955 through the early 1960s, Ray Kroc was opening McDonald's franchises at an accelerating pace. The brand was becoming a household name, and he was personally making almost nothing. Trust me, I've run some companies. I know that feeling. The deal he signed gave him a small percentage of franchise sales after he paid the brothers their cut. But the franchise fees were really low. The brothers had set them low because they didn't really care about franchising in the first place and didn't want it to be complicated. So Kroc was running the entire operation, doing all the work, and the math just didn't leave him much to actually take home. A lot of business owners fall into that trap. If you're one of them, please pay yourself first. He came close to bankruptcy more than once, and he took out personal loans against his life insurance policy just to keep the lights on. He also took out second mortgages on the family home over his wife Ethel's objection, by the way, to fund the business. I would have liked to have been there for that dinner table conversation. Anyway, the guy was 55, 56, 57 years old. He had diabetes. He had arthritis, and he was going to work every day. He was opening more stores. He was protecting the system, and he was quietly running out of money. I'll be honest, I tried to nail down whether Kroc was actually as close to bankruptcy as the standard narrative around this story says he was, or whether the story has gotten more dramatic over time, the way these things tend to do, right? And as far as I can tell, the sources mostly agree that he was financially stressed. He was grinding it out. His own account frames it as being in genuine financial trouble. John Love McDonald's Behind the Arches corroborates the broad strokes of this as well. So I'm comfortable saying he was in real financial trouble during this stretch, even if the exact level of broke varies depending on which source you trust. Now, there's a quote that Kroc had framed in his office and apparently quoted constantly, as popularly attributed to Calvin Coolidge though the actual origin is disputed by historians. Either way, Kroc adopted it as basically his personal motto. And here's the quote: "Press on. Nothing in the world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent." I usually roll my eyes at founder mantras and here's my point on this part, because I think it's the most important part of the entire story. There's no breakthrough moment in these years. Remember how I told you there's no aha epiphany like we see in movies? There's no big speech. There's no movie scene. There's just a tired man in his late 50s refusing to quit when every rational signal in his life was telling him that he needed to quit. If Kroc had cashed out in 1958 or 1959, which honestly would have been the rational thing to do, McDonald's as we know it doesn't exist today. So the next thing, the thing that actually builds the empire, only happens because he was still in the game when it showed up. And the truth is, most founder stories have some variation of this 6 broke years section, but the highlight reels skip it. It's where the founders who actually build something get separated from the ones who don't. Which brings us to move number 2, and this is the one most people get wrong, even if they've heard it. What happened was, in 1955, Kroc hired a guy named Harry Sonneborn. I cannot pronounce that name right. Harry Sonneborn as VP of Administration and Finance. Sonneborn looked at the McDonald's business and saw something Kroc had completely missed. And what he did was he sat Kroc down and he said, and this line ends up in every business school case study, by the way, "You're not in the hamburger business. You're in the real estate business. You just don't know it yet." Now, this is the part of the story that almost always gets compressed into a single sentence in business articles, and I think it was like one scene in the movie. But if I just say Sonneborn figured out the real estate model, you don't actually understand what changed. So let me walk you through it and stay with me on this because it's important. Now, picture this. It's the late 1950s. You want to open a McDonald's franchise. You call up Ray Kroc and you say, "Hey, I'd like to buy a franchise." He says, "Great, here are the terms." You pay a franchise fee, and at the time it was relatively low, and you agree to operate under McDonald's standard. Then Kroc tells you to go out and find your own location. So you do. You drive around your town, maybe near the highway? Too noisy. Maybe downtown? Too expensive. You're driving past the local high school, and actually, you know what? That's perfect. The kids will walk over after class, and you spot a half-acre commercial lot on the busy road right next to it. Call up the guy who owns the lot, and it turns out to be some random landlord. Let's call him Phil. Phil owns the parcel, and what Phil says is, "Sure, I'll lease you the land for, let's say, $2,000 a month." So you sign a 20-year lease with Phil, then you build the restaurant on Phil's land. And the restaurant does well because every McDonald's at the time was doing well. Still the case as far as I know. And you pay Phil $24,000 a year. You're paying Kroc a small percentage royalty on your sales. Now look at who's making money in that picture. You, the franchisee, are making the operating profit on the restaurant. Phil, the random landlord in your town, is collecting $24,000 a year for virtually nothing, and Ray Kroc, who built the brand and the system, is collecting a few $1,000s in royalty. The local landlord is making roughly 10 times what Kroc is making off Kroc's own brand. That's the structure that Sonneborn looked at and said, this is broken. So Sonnenborn's idea was McDonald's, the company, should be the one leasing or buying the land, not Phil. So McDonald's leases it from the original landowner or buys it outright. And then McDonald's leases it to you, the franchisee, at a markup. Now you're paying McDonald's $3,000 a month for the land. McDonald's keeps the spread between what they pay Phil and what they charge you, plus your royalty on sales. Plus, because McDonald's now owns or controls the real estate, every store putting adds to the company's balance sheet permanently. The land appreciates over decades. The rent grows. The franchisee operates the restaurant, but McDonald's owns the foundation that it sits on. This is the move. This is the entire game. So in 1956, Sonneborn formalized the strategy through a real estate subsidiary called Franchise Realty Corporation. That's a clever name. Anyway, and from the moment that structure went into effect, McDonald's started compounding wealth in a way no restaurant chain had ever done before. And honestly, if you're watching this and building something, the lesson from this part is the one I'd actually tattoo on my arm if I didn't already have a red dragon on my arm. The visible business is almost never where the money is. The visible business is the burgers. The real business is the real estate that the burgers make possible. Most founders never figure this out, but Kroc and Sonneborn did. Or fine, Sonneborn figured it out for him, and Kroc was smart enough to listen, which, by the way, is also a thing. A lot of some founders aren't smart enough to listen when the finance guy walks in and tells them they're missing the obvious thing. Which gets us to move number 3, the buyout. So by 1961, the real estate structure was throwing off enough cash that Kroc could finally do the thing he'd been wanting to do for 6 years. He could buy the McDonald brothers out entirely. Now, I want you to take a guess. How much do you think Kroc paid the McDonald brothers in 1961 to walk away from the company they founded? I'll wait. The answer is $2.7 million in cash in 1961, which adjusted for inflation is somewhere around $28 to $30 million in 2026 money. Now, Kroc obviously did not have $2.7 million sitting around. He had to borrow it from a consortium of college endowments, including Princeton's, arranged by a financier named John Bristol. The terms were brutal. 6% interest plus, and this is the part that's actually crazy, a 0.5% of McDonald's sales paid to those lenders going forward. Kroc said it himself later in a 1973 Time magazine interview, or he said, the $2.7 million ended up costing me $14 million. That ongoing royalty over the decades ended up costing the company hundreds of millions of dollars, and by some measures, it was one of the most expensive loans in business history. But Kroc did the deal. He bought the brothers out and he owned McDonald's outright. And he was 59 years old at this point, and from that moment forward, the empire just compounded. The Big Mac, the Egg McMuffin, the first drive-through window, Ronald McDonald, the playground, the Happy Meal. I had a birthday party there when I was a kid, all of it. That was what happened. And by the time that Kroc died in 1984, there were over 7,500 McDonald's locations, and he was personally worth around 500 to 600 million, which is in the ballpark of 1.5 to 1.8 billion dollars in 2026 money. So here's how I see this whole story. When people tell the Ray Kroc story, they usually focus on one of two things. Either the moment he saw the system in San Bernardino, the whole everyone saw a burger joint, Kroc saw a system thing, or they tell it as a villain story where he stole the company from the McDonald's brothers. And look, both of those things have some truth to them. Not going to deny that. I think it's overstated what he did to the McDonald's brothers, but you have your own opinions, whatever. That moment in San Bernardino, though, that was a real moment. And again, the buyout terms were ruthless, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I'll also just be honest about something that I really fully couldn't pin down. The verbal 0.5% royalty Kroc allegedly promised the brothers on top of $2.7 million in cash, the sources flat out contradict each other. The brothers' nephew, Ronald McDonald, has asserted Kroc broke a handshake agreement that would have made the family rich for life. But Lisa Napoli, who wrote a recent book on the brothers called Ray and Joan, explicitly disputes this. Her exact quote is this: Ray was ruthless, but he didn't screw them out of a 0.5% of royalty. There's no written evidence of the handshake deal either way. Kroc's autobiography actually skips over it. The McDonald's corporate version downplays it. I'm not going to claim to know the truth on that specific point. If you read more on it than I have, then drop it in the comments. But neither of those framings, the genius moment story or the villain story, is really the actual story. The actual story, as far as I can tell, is that Ray Kroc built McDonald's by doing 3 things most founders never do. He didn't quit during the years when the math didn't work. He figured out, or fine, he was smart enough to listen to the finance guys who figured out that the customer-facing business was not the actual business. And when he finally had the structure in place, he made one expensive, terrifying bet to own the whole thing outright at the age of 59. The empire didn't get built by stealing the brothers' company. It got built by years of not quitting, followed by one big terrifying bet, most of which happens in the years that nobody puts in the movie. And here's my actual takeaway after spending a few weeks on this. The visible business is almost never where the money is. The real business is usually the invisible structure underneath that the visible business makes possible. Find that. That's the move. If you don't take anything else from this video, take that. And honestly, the reason this story stuck with me long enough to make a video about it and have it be the first video on my new channel is the work history I mentioned at the top. When you've actually stood at a McDonald's station and run a shift as a floor supervisor, the obsession with the system isn't an abstract business school case study. It's the air you breathe at that job. Kroc out cleaning his own parking lot in the Des Plaines is the same energy as the shift manager who walked me through fry timing protocols in 1995. Thank you, Benny, by the way, for that. The system is identical. The discipline is identical. That's the real legacy of this guy. Not the buyout, not the real estate, not any of that stuff from the movie, the system. And then the other thing, and this is maybe more important, honestly, 52 is not too late. 57 is not too late. 59 is not too late. As long as you can breathe, you can still succeed. The story everyone tells about overnight success is usually a lie. The actual founder stories, the one that builds something real, almost always have their equivalent of a 6 broke years section that nobody talks about because it's not interesting on the highlight reel. The highlight reel is the lie. The full story is the thing. So let me know in the comments, what do you think was actually the key here? Was it the 6 broke years where he didn't quit? Was it the real estate flip with Sonneborn? Was it the buyout? Or was it just the willingness to take that initial bet at 52 when most people would have folded and went home? Genuinely curious which one you think was the real move. If you've got a personal Ray Kroc memory or a McDonald's memory that meant something to you, maybe it's a road trip, whatever, drop that in the comments too. I'd love to hear about it because I want to hear what you have to say. I want this to be a collaborative channel. And if you enjoyed stories like this one, like the full founder story, not the highlight reel, we're going to be dropping new episodes at least twice a week. And if you want to learn more about some recent things that McDonald's have done, check out this video from Michael Girdley on his channel. And most of all, think big.